An End to All Endings, a talk presented by Dr. David Bentley Hart on June 26, 2006, during St. Vladimir Seminary's Liturgical Institute of Music and Pastoral Practice.
I have a confession to make. I've been altering this paper constantly since arriving here, in part because this morning the first speaker covered certain topics I'd intended to cover, saying many of the things I might have said, and I figured I shouldn't simply treat you to a repetition of statements already made. The other confession I have to make, however, is that I can't read what I have written on the paper here, because I've been suffering from migraines recently as a result of a brush with Lyme disease. And I took the medication today because one was coming on and it blurs my vision. So if at times I appear to be losing my way, don't worry, I'm simply losing my way. And anyway, I want to thank, first of all, Father Erickson for the hyperbole of that introduction. But I was very grateful for it. Dubious as to how well deserved it is, but I'm grateful, and I'm glad to be here. This is my first visit to St. Vladimir's, actually. I've been Orthodox for 20 years, and I've meant to come here many times, and I've simply never had the opportunity. One thing or another has always come up, so this is my first chance to visit, and I'm enjoying it a very great deal. The reason I was asked here, as Father Erickson says, I suppose is because of this little book on the tsunami that was not my idea to write. It followed in the wake of some columns I produced, which were also not my idea to write. I don't generally write on the issue of theodicy, of the question of the moral conundrum of how a just and merciful God could have created a world full of misery and bound to death. But each step along the way, someone came to me and, offering money, convinced me to write something. And as I wrote, I learned a great deal. Well, let me begin this way. Like many persons, and many of you may have had a similar, many of you perhaps can share this, have shared this experience. I can remember quite clearly the first mysterious instant when, as a very small child, I became all at once conscious of myself and of the world around me and of other persons in a way I had not been until that moment. And I mean, it was an instant. Now, I was not without memory. I knew, for instance, that the woman standing across the dining room table from me was my mother. I knew that when she told me that my father was going to be home soon, that I would know him, although I could not summon up a picture of him in my mind. None of this, however, none of this memory, such as it was, consisted in any kind of distinct recollection of anything that had happened to me up until that moment. Now, I know others have had, others remember this moment in their own lives because others have told me, and there's very, and others have recorded it. Vladimir Nabokov in Speak Memory talks of the moment when he suddenly became aware of himself at the age of 4, walking through a park holding hands with his parents. All of us, whether we recall it or not, I'm fairly certain, passed this boundary, and it's a moment at which we awaken from an almost animal sense of sheer immediacy and are ushered forth from the dream world of infancy into a universe that's quite separate from ourselves, in which we find ourselves both entirely at home, inexplicably, but entirely at home, and at the same time quite perplexingly strangers. Now, what's somewhat more difficult, or what I can't recall at all, however, is when I first became conscious of death, at least of my death. And I suspect this is also true of most people, that it's, in this case, a somewhat more gradual awakening that we go through, and impossible usually to isolate as a discrete moment within consciousness. somewhere, as we emerge from, and I suppose it's sort of the pure present of infancy, where we know nothing really of anxiety or hope except agitations of joy or fear, perhaps. We know desire, we know aversion, we know displeasure, we know joy, but we don't really know anxiety or hope. We don't form a sense of the future in that way. Somewhere we become progressively aware of our mortality. And suddenly our world possesses dimensions and possibilities and limits that it did not until that moment. We depart, so to speak, from the garden of our first innocence and find ourselves enclosed by the horizon of finite time. Death thereafter, not in a conscious way necessarily, but thereafter definitely becomes our constant companion. Both as a species and as individuals, this awareness of our mortality estranges us from the natural world to an almost absolute degree. Because we're unique among creatures in this ability to recognize that our life has an end towards which it's moving, and to turn our wills and our desires and our plans and our fears towards that distant prospect. But it also creates a division within us, and I try not to make this needlessly obscure and complicated, which is my normal habit, because I think this is also something we all know. There was a very famous anthropologist who in 1920, Lucien levy-bruhl, who in 1922 produced a book on the primitive mind, quote unquote. It was quite acceptable to use that term then, in which he pointed out that one of the distinctive traits of the so-called primitive mind was the inability of persons in tribal societies throughout the world, many, to conceive of death as natural. Now, his inability to conceive of death as natural. And as it happens, this is true. Field researches of anthropologists over the decades have confirmed that in many tribal societies throughout the world, it's assumed that every death is unnatural. That is, it's the effect of poison or evil spirits or magic or some adventitious agency, a demon or a god or an enemy, seen or unseen. And in that way, every death, and this is true even of those who are very old, who have been infirm for years, every death is in some sense a murder. It's the violent interruption of a life that might have continued indefinitely. Now, of course, most of us, good modern people that we are, would assume that this is simply a defect of understanding. You know, that here we're talking about entire cultures that have never fully ventured out of the perpetual present of the infant, and so have not matured into a fuller appreciation of reality. And if they just had more coursework on organic chemistry, they could be disabused of this. Although, what exactly they're supposed to be ignorant of, it would be hard to say, because they're aware of aging and death. They see the same cycle of life and death that we do. I want to endorse their view of things, the so-called primitive view of things. At least I think at some very profound level, the so-called primitive intuition is surely correct. And I'm not saying this for theological reasons yet. I just think that simply said, it's just a matter of the human consciousness of reality. Death can never be unequivocally natural for us, precisely because we're conscious of it. And I mean that in two senses. As organisms, we're subject, like all organisms, like all animals, to the inescapable circularity of natural existence. We know this. Each creature feeds upon other creatures to be devoured by other creatures in turn. One generation succeeds another in infinitum. At this level, we know we belong to the circle of nature, but as rational beings, blessed and burdened with reflective consciousness, it's hopeless. Our existence is not simply circular or organic. It's perspective, it's creative, it's open to the future. The horizon of human consciousness is an openness to an indefinite future, which aims, so to speak, naturally beyond nature, We have projects, we have plans, we have expectations, we have ambitions and great ideas, grand desires. We know that time is a realm of possibilities. We know that the time granted to us is not limited. But still, to be human is to possess consciously a future and to turn one's will and imagination towards it. And for that very reason, because to be open to the future, to be desirous of a future, to be able to imagine and to live as we do towards the future, death always comes as a stranger. Even if as a stranger is also a guest, long anticipated, coming late in the day, nevertheless, every death is the abrupt conclusion of a story whose potential was not necessarily limited except by the accidental realities of physical cessation. And so, to try to simplify this, we find ourselves at two removes from the natural world. First, we know we'll die. We have no way of returning to that condition of perfect, spontaneous immediacy in which we were immersed for the first few years of our lives, and which I imagine is the condition of animal consciousness for the most part. Perhaps dolphins know better, I don't know. But I mean, we can assume that this is unique to human beings. And second, precisely because we're aware of the future and live towards the future, death itself arrives as something contrary to the very essence of who we are, which is to be open to what is yet to come. Now, obviously, I'm pitching this. I mean, one could just as well say, well, what I'm really saying is that we're the only animal to whom death is natural, because we're the only ones for whom a consciousness of finitude makes us capable of having stories to interrupt, and death gives shape and purpose and urgency to how we conduct our lives. And so death is part of us, and this is true as well. But even this, and this is the only point I want to make here at this moment, is our consciousness of death nonetheless alienates us, estranges us, sets us apart from the world in which we find ourselves. It provokes, it torments, it threatens us. The possibility of nothingness, the absence of any final meaning, the impossibility of recompense for our sufferings. But for this openness to the future that defines what it is to be human, that both makes us conscious of our deaths and makes death an interruption of our lives, but for this exile from the circle of natural life and natural death, we would suffer neither hope nor despair. We would not be strangers in the world. We would, or so it might seem, be at peace. Now, the greatest masters of suspicion in the 19th and 20th centuries, that is the great generation of those who came along to instruct us that the religious and the metaphysical and the spiritual desires of all the generations of man were misplaced, have assumed that human mortality, the awareness of mortality unique to the species, is the reason why religions evolve. That there is some pathetic human longing for some sort of compensation beyond the grave, some reward, some release. That there is some social, psychological need on our parts to make the burden of our existence more tolerable. For Marx, for instance, religion, which he calls the heart of a heartless world, the sweet and tender opiate that soothes the misery of a suffering and hopeless humanity. It's actually quite a tender passage in Marx, which is often misquoted. This will necessarily vanish once social justice is established. And Freud, of course, notoriously saw all religious longing as an illusion that science will render incredible to all of us one day. And in about 600 places where he asserts flatly that the origin of faith is clearly the fear of death and personal destruction. This is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make when you look at the sort of therapeutic nature that religion serves in 19th century Vienna, say, liberal Protestant culture, polite Catholic culture, the Jewish culture he knew. But as it happens, and this is important to understand, I think, all the evidence shows that the religious impulse in human society, at least for its first millennium or so, has no obvious connection at all with hope in an afterlife. When we examine the beliefs of early civilizations anywhere in the world, we find that very few had any concrete notion of a life beyond this life. And practically none imagined that if there were such a life, it was reserved for any but a very special few. Most ancient cultures, and I'm talking East Asia, the Near East, Mesopotamia, the Peloponnese, Africa, had some vague concept of a kind of shadowy, spectral half-existence beyond death, Hades, a dark, barren, joyless underworld or otherworld, but almost no one thought that death brought a happier existence. The Old Testament, as has already been said today, John Garvey first, promises nothing in the way of an afterlife or resurrection until, well, very late in its pages, the apocalyptic period, obviously. But the Hebrew Bible tells us little more than that what awaits us beyond this world is Sheol, a sort of abyss in which impalpable shadows of ourselves linger on amid the dust and darkness. To die is to be cut off from the land of the living and to be cut off from God permanently. And one can truly live on only in one's children. And the same is true of ancient Greek religion, if art and myth are to be believed. So many of you have read the Odyssey. You might remember how the shade of Achilles tells Odysseus that it would be better to live the meanest life of the most wretched man upon the face of the earth than to be king over all the dead. Or in the Iliad, when the great heroes die, when Diomedes on the field of glory kills his enemy, all that happens then is the soul goes forth, the breath goes forth like a squeaking bat to the underworld to disappear into the darkness. Or at the end of the Odyssey, Hermes leads the shades of the slain suitors away. He's the psychopompus, the guide of souls to the underworld. But where they're going is a place of despair and fragmentary memory and emptiness. And that's all we have to look forward to. Or in the great Mesopotamian epic, Gilgamesh, Enkidu on his deathbed, describes very much the same thing. It's called the House of Dust. In fact, in the epic, most of the epic is about Gilgamesh's desire to find immortality. He goes to find Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who's the one immortal man, to find the secret of immortality. And he's told us there's no point. But there is a plant. If he could eat the plant, that might make him immortal. But unfortunately, after he secures the plant, he's not sure if he should trust it. He's going to test it on some subjects back home. And he goes for a swim, and a serpent eats the plant. And it's sort of a just so story. That's why serpents shed their skin now. They're immortal. But anyway, the epic ends with Gilgamesh hopelessly looking, well, not hopelessly, but resignedly looking at the walls of his great city of Uruk. And knowing that, and what you take from it is that's where his immortality lies, such as it is. And yet, the interesting thing is that all of these Asian, Mesopotamian cultures were profoundly religious. They worshipped their gods with offerings, hymns, prayers. They built temples and erected altars. They weren't materialists as such. They didn't think of this as just so much animated matter that dies away. But manifestly, belief in an afterlife, hope for rescue from the turmoils of this world, is not the source of much of the world's religion, not in its most original forms. is not to deny that there's a relation at the profoundest level between the human consciousness of death and religious belief. And of course, as religions develop, the idea of the afterlife tends in most of them to assume more concrete and more inviting features. But, and this might be a controversial statement, but there's no one here who wants to argue with me on it, I'm sure, so I'll make it anyway. That if death is in some sense the cause of religion, at least of a certain sort of religion, it's not because it promises us a better life beyond this life. It's not because it offers us a compensation for our sufferings, and it's not because it makes the fear of death go away. It's rather that religion serves, and here I agree with Father Schmemann to a degree, it reconciles us to death by making death familiar, explicable, rational, and natural to us. At least in some of its more primordial forms, the principal function of many of the more venerable forms of religious practice seems to have been one of overcoming our estrangement from the world, from the circle of nature, not by promising us another better world, but by reintroducing us, reintegrating us into the cycle of nature, of natural life and natural death. And obviously the ritual act by which this was accomplished most succinctly and most magnificently was one or another form of sacrifice. Now, sacrifice is a word that has many different meanings. I'm speaking here of a very specific kind of sacrifice, a sort of do-des. You give the god something, you slay something, you destroy something in order to feed the god or feed your ancestors, as the case may be, in order to secure in return a certain benefit, a supernatural benefit, a political benefit, but there's an exchange made. And this is a sort of economy, the sacred economy by which a society sustains itself. But I think in another sense it's not too abstract and it's not too wild a suggestion to say that much religion, much ancient religion, which lies at the base of all of our religious cultures in some sense or another, has been an attempt to soothe the anguish occasioned in us by that spiritual dignity or abnormality in our nature that estranges us from the perennial cosmic cycle of life and death and burdens us with apprehension and grief and all those other things that a consciousness of time and death bequeaths us. Sacrifice of a certain sort makes death meaningful to us again. It allows us to return to the circle of nature because we know that the meaning of life is death. The meaning of death is life. There's a constant exchange. And sacrificial mythology, and I'm not just saying this as sort of making vague anthropological statements. You can confirm this from any number of religious texts. The Rig Veda, for instance, would be a good place to look, or commentaries on the horse sacrifice in later Vedantic literature in India. It's a way of saying that the circle of life and death that we see in nature itself belongs to a greater cosmic cycle of life and death to which even the gods belong. Even the gods require our sacrifices. There must be death so that there can be new life. And it's not just the organic, animal, vegetable life, our life, the life of the body, but the life of the cosmos itself depends on this economy of death. And in sacrificing, we can become conscious participants in that cycle, in that economy. And this brings a very real peace. We have found our way back past the enigma of death to its sacred truth. Death doesn't become inviting, but it becomes meaningful. It becomes, in fact, the index of meaning of all things. And now, especially, and this leads, this sacrificial sense of reality leads quite naturally to the image of the whole universe as a great cycle of feeding. A system of balanced transactions governed by fate, by finitude, by the limits of possibility. The Aztecs, for instance, said, just endless, interminable flow of human victims sacrificed to the sun god Tonatiuh. If they didn't, the sun would die. Because they knew that this celestial god, like all gods, thrived on death. A more elevated version, again, the Rig Veda, there's the myth of what's called the cosmic man Purusha, and this myth says that the whole universe came into being because the great cosmic man, Purusha, sacrificed himself, and the heavens and the earth and the underworld all sprang from his severed limbs. Even as the idea of a more concrete idea of the afterlife tends to develop in most cultures, it's still bound to this notion of sacrificial economy. You can see this in India. We think now of something vaguely called Hinduism, which involves the idea, in India, punabhavanga, reincarnation, re-becoming. But before that was the case, in the Vedic period, there was no notion of reincarnation, but there was the notion of successive planes where your ancestors lived, going back 4 generations, after which they were extinguished entirely. And the circles and the sacrifices that were practiced were to keep your ancestors alive until it was your time to take the place of one, and the top of the ladder disappeared. So what am I saying? I sum this up, that in this sense, understood in this way, religion really is an opiate. Not, again, because it promises a happy life beyond this life. Rather, it allows one to embrace death and to be reconciled to it. In fact, to learn that the meaning of life lies in the surrender to death. One learns, in fact, to offer oneself up and all that one loves, everyone that one loves, because one knows that one cannot protest this, but for this reality, life-consuming life, the delicate balances of the universe would fail. The very light of heaven would die away. Now, why am I going on at such length? Let me step back a moment to talk about the book, The Doors of the Sea. What I learned chiefly when I was reading up on writing that book, this was not long after the tsunami. It was not long after the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. And it was actually, as I was writing it, that the death toll was really put in proper proportion. We're talking about more than 250,000 deaths. What was instructive to me, part of the book deals with critiques of those who are foolish enough to believe in God at all. There was a great outpouring in the press of fashionable, this proves it at last. Obviously the last slender supports of your imbecile credence has been just torn away by this, because now we know there cannot be a merciful God. And this was especially true in the British press, especially true in The Guardian, which seemed to, briefly for a week, to become the paper devoted to the evangel that there is no God. But those arguments didn't interest me very much because they weren't very good arguments. They were all based on a sort of childish notion of what Christians or any other religious believer actually thinks about God. They were completely unaware, it seemed, that there were any doctrines like the fall of humanity, or that there might have been times in the past, say, when Christians have shown that they're aware that there's such a thing as death. And maybe that they might have actually developed some thoughts about it. But more disturbing to me were actually things produced by Christians, because they were wonderfully consoling quite often. And I got drawn into debates I didn't want to, but because of my initial column, which appeared in the Wall Street Journal, which I was asked to write on this. I got drawn into debates because I did something I never do, which is I responded to a blog, which I think, hell is nothing but an endless weblog. There's no way of extricating yourself from one of these things, because no one ever gets the point, and even if they do, they want to make an... So for a while, briefly, I went along with the argument and then contemplated self-slaughter and then wrote the book as a way of... It was astonishing. Some just reflected their traditions. There were some very rigorous Calvinists whose image of God is remarkably cruel. I have no other way of putting it. This is not true of all Calvinists. It was true of a very small subset of fundamentalist Calvinists for whom it says, this is just the sovereignty of God displaying itself in His wrath and in His power to create life and to destroy life. And, there were others, though, Catholics and Orthodox usually came up with responses I liked better, but even those were premised on consolations of the most banal sort quite often. They were, well, it's all part of God's plan. We'll see the point of it in the end. That is, God has a plan for creation which culminates in the kingdom, and along the way certain disagreeable necessities have to be dealt with. Bizarre, a very devout Catholic who was actually quite an educated man suggested, well, everyone really deserves to die. And and God knows exactly what kind of sin we're going to commit or have committed, and He precisely apportions the punishments. And so everyone who died in the tsunami was sort of killed at the time when God knew that would take care of whatever sins and transgressions. And of course, a third of those who died were under the age of 8, but this didn't seem to make a difference really, because it's a very complicated notion of how we had sinned in Adam. And on it went, and again, these more and more religious explanations of how Christians should view the tsunami, all of them trying to make death explicable, meaningful, something to which we should resign ourselves. The last day when I was writing, I'm completely departed from my text here, so I'll work my way back in a moment, but I can't see it anyway. But the last day I was writing the book, I was reading the New York Times, which I very rarely do. We don't get it down in Maryland, and it's also a lousy newspaper. But I was reading it, and it told the story, it was in Sri Lanka, of this man. It was an immensely powerful man. He was just one of these fellows who could throw 500 pounds of weight on his back and carry it along a dock. That's what he did for a living. He'd lost 4 of his children when the tsunami struck. He couldn't save any of them. And he was reciting to the reporter the names of his children, and he ended in descending order of age, and ended with the 4-year-old son. And as he did so, he broke down in tears. Now, what struck me about that was, we all know this, everyone knows this, that had we been confronted by that man, there would not be one of us who would be such a moral imbecile as to walk up to him and say, well, you see, your children had to die. It was part of God's plan, or it was an expression of God's sovereignty, or, no. And the reason we wouldn't say it is not because it would be in bad taste at that moment, but because at that moment, confronted with the reality of the absolute and irredeemable evil of the death of children, we would know that what we were saying was a lie. And the only reason we'd be saying it would be to let ourselves off the hook. Well, we believe in a merciful God, no matter how many of your children are dead. Now, maybe I'm making, I don't want to make this needlessly complex, but I want to step back. This is all I meant to do in that book as well, to remind people that in the New Testament, what we find is not consolation in the face of death that reconciles us to the necessity of death. That we are bound to a body of death and must die, that we must take up our cross. All of this is there, yes. But what was odd to me in all of these responses to the tsunami disaster issuing from the pens of good Christians was the almost complete absence, it seemed to me, of the sheer radical nature of the evangel. And I think we're often in danger of forgetting precisely to what degree the proclamation of Easter does not meet our religious expectations and does not fulfill our religious needs. It's a completely different order of hope. It's a completely different order of joy. It gives us joy, but it also does so at the price of certain consolations upon which many of us habitually, in which whole societies depend. I mean, when I was talking about a sacrificial vision of reality earlier, I was talking about something that's not just confined to the world of religion. Most of the great ancient civilizations, most ancient cultures, starting from this notion of the sacred order of the cosmos, construct legal systems, political, social orders all around these negotiations with death. In Roman law, for instance, and I could demonstrate this if I had to, but in Roman law, for instance, and this is true actually in Levitical law as well. It's not. I'm not just about the evil pagans. I just mean this is the normal. Someone sentenced to death by the state is a mactatio in Latin. It's a sacrifice. One is put to death as a sacrifice in order to restore proper piety to the gods, in order to preserve the order of the empire. You know, all death is part of that economy. All judicious uses of death are part of that economy. And you can see precisely what sort of society is at stake in the Gospels. I always return to it when I'm writing. It could be that I'm just unimaginative and tend to return to the same things over and over again. But I think it's more that I find it so haunting is in the Gospel of John, the confrontation between Pilate and Christ. Because if you know the literature of antiquity, if you think yourself back into the time, you have Pilate is a representative of the empire, a man of noble birth. He represents law and order. He is, he is consecrated to the emperor, consecrated to the gods of the empire. And Jesus is a mad colonial, technically a slave of the empire, because all non-citizens were vuli, they were servi. They were in legal terms they could be classified as slaves, or a kind of free man who was a slave, a sort of shadowy thing. If you were to stand in the position of the ancient, there'd be no question where truth was to be found. It would be with Pilate. He represented the full splendor and grandeur, but also the responsibility of empire, of keeping chaos at bay, of using death to keep order, to allow life to prosper and continue, whereas Jesus would be a threat to order. Jesus would be the agent of disorder whose preaching and whose charisma somehow would threaten the stability of the society in which he found himself. And the death of Christ, it's not even, we shouldn't even use the word justice as we tend to use it now. The death of Christ would be a thing eminently just, because it would preserve the order of the world. Not a question of his guilt or innocence. It's a question of what negotiations have to be made. And all societies, in some sense, embrace this economy. There are regrettable decisions to be made. Jesus is put to death by all the responsible authorities of his time and place. And had he just died, and that had been the end of the story, it would have been something that could have been interpreted any number of ways, but it would have fitted our religious expectations. That is, in some sense, we would understand its inevitability. It had to happen. His teachings might live on after him. He would be a renowned sage, but he would be gone, and the whole story would have a kind of tragic fullness to it, because an end had been given to his story. Because death, and this is death's great service to us, gives us an end to our stories that makes them meaningful. But then comes Easter. And for some reason, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I think sometimes we tend to forget that the gospel of Easter is not just something that seems incredible and seemed incredible. It was in some sense subversive of the whole sacred order of the universe. Because what happened at Easter was that the sane, responsible, prudent decisions made by those who were responsible for sustaining the economy of life and death, the economy of chaos and order, the social reality of the universe in which Jesus was located, had passed their verdicts, discharged their offices, done what he expected them, and God had passed his judgment, and it absolutely reversed those verdicts. Christ was not assumed into a hereafter in a simple sense. Christ did not disappear into the divine mystery. God did not confirm the verdict of his judges. God did not accept the finality of death, its meaningfulness. He didn't take the well-rounded story of Jesus with its tragic conclusion and make something beautiful out of it. Rather, God shattered the power of death in Christ. And in that moment, the whole rationality of a world reconciled to death collapsed. After all, there's no older religious wisdom. And again, I'm not making statements about all non-Christian religions. That's not what I mean. But there's a religious wisdom that we all share going back to the beginning of human piety. There's no older religious wisdom than the one that teaches us that there's a sacred necessity and irreversibility of death. And that a victim that has been once offered up to the gods or order or the divine has to be then transformed into some higher, more abstract good. But that's not what happens. Rather, it is still the person, Jesus of Nazareth, in his particularity, who is vindicated over against all the powers, the political powers, the cosmic powers, the power of death itself. And in that moment, what is revealed is that, according to the divine vantage, which is revealed in Christ, death is not part of God's order. It is not God's final word. It is not part of his economy. And then what becomes of all our sacrifices? What becomes of all the resignations we've had to make and all the reconciliations? We discover that we are no longer permitted to enjoy the solace of a certain sort of religious resignation. We can't just sink away into the chaos of nature. Death is no longer there a thing to be mastered and understood as part of the cosmos. Incredibly, we've been told that death itself, which has been made natural to us at the expense of so many victims and at such a huge expense of cultural, religious labor, that death itself never was the truth of things. Death, which religion, culture, just practical wisdom had made familiar to us and even meaningful for us, becomes a stranger to us again. Essentially meaningless, ultimately unjust, no matter what the workings of divine providence may do with any given moment of death. Nonetheless, death itself no longer fits. And this is a very simple thing, I know, but for some reason it strikes me that somehow we don't always appreciate it, that contrary to the best, the most prudent, the most serious religious and philosophical reflection of much of human culture, which teaches us, well, yes, we have emerged from that ignorance of death that was our special condition as children. Can we now be reconciled to the cosmic reality of death? Instead, what the gospel says is, well, no. The real question is whether the world can be redeemed from death, because that strangeness of death to us, that sense of alienation and distance between ourselves, is in fact an index of truth. It points us towards something truer than the practical wisdom that culture and religion and so much of our social history would have us embrace. In a sense, the resurrection of Christ calls us to a second naivete, I don't want to say post-religious. Again, it sounds as if I'm simply condemning religion in the abstract, but a post-critical return to our most primordial intuition of death as something unnatural, obscene, intrinsically evil. And a return, in a sense, to that disquiet before the power of death, its power to interrupt our natural orientation towards the future, which is the thing from which supposedly all the wisdom of the ages was supposed to deliver us. What we discover is that disquiet perhaps was always a sign of a created openness to God and His kingdom, and that in a sense the odd tendency of primitive man to see death as unnatural turns out to be a sign of spiritual wisdom, a perfectly correct sense that most of us would do well to try to recover. The true nature of spiritual beings created in the divine image. And that maybe even that strange and haunting and irrecoverable immediacy of the small child's experience of the world is a foretaste of our true home. Having departed from the garden of our first innocence, as I called it earlier, we're called not to become disenchanted realists, content to dwell here under the dominion of death, looking for rationales for why there is death, why this person dies, refusing to acknowledge the sheer idiot hideousness of death, refusing to recognize death as a thing that is evil, but instead learning to be wise and at peace with it. No, we're summoned rather to enter into the city of a second and higher innocence, which knows death only as a shadow and a falsehood overcome by infinite love. I probably should stop here because of the time emerged, and also because I cannot see, as I said, what I've written. Let me just say this. When I originally called the paper An End to All Endings, because in its original form I was going to harp on the power of death to round out our lives with an ending, I intended to end, and I won't, but I intended to end with a much longer passage, with a long passage from Gregory of Nyssa, who, for some reason, is my favorite of the Church Fathers. I'm not always sure why. I mean, he's great fun to read, but he can be frustrating in ways that are difficult to enumerate. One of the things that always impressed me, there was never, I think, among the fathers, there's no one with the exception of Augustine who gives such poignant descriptions of the sorrow of death at times. He, in his book on virginity, he describes the awareness of mortality that haunts our love of other persons, our love of our wives or husbands. And yet, in his spiritual treatises, I mean, this is notoriously the case, when he talks of union with God, he uses the image of being outstretched, epektasis, this being open to God and perpetually progressing to ever greater depths of God's beauty and abundance and intimacy and forever, because God is infinite and inexhaustible and we're finite, and so we grow and expand and progress forever and ever and ever into the infinity of God. And the curious thing is, wherever he talks about this, he's talking about the spiritual life and the life beyond death, life here in this world, life in the world to come, and it's impossible to recognize the boundary. Occasionally he stops and acknowledges that there is such a thing as death, but his spiritual wisdom is utterly wrapped up in this openness to the divine future. To the point that at times it seems as if death does not exist for him at all. And that's what I mean by second higher innocence. He's not unaware of death. He's not a child. He's not descended into a second childhood. But that openness to the future, which I said is strangely characteristic of us all, has for him, because of this revolutionary annunciation of Easter, which does not confirm but in many ways subverts our religious expectations and the kind of religious comfort we're able to create for ourselves. Because of this annunciation, he has returned to a sense of this openness that's now transfigured beyond description. This openness to the future, the joy, the anticipation, the delight, the expectation has become infinite. And so this is where I wanted to leave. It's just that there's this joy, and it's premised now upon a radically, on a single historical claim. Either you believe it or you do not. Either you believe that Easter happened or you do not. If you believe it, this joy comes to. And other sorts of consolation, other sorts of solace, like the explicability of death, the notion that you can somehow explain away the death of a child as being part of God's good purpose, a sort of sense of being at home in a cosmos as we know it, that's gone. That sort of consolation, and whenever it creeps back into Christian discourse, should be recognized as a thing alien to the gospel. But the joy that we are given, as I said, has this kind of radical and catastrophic character to it. You must believe in Easter. Or if you do not, well, then it's not given to you. And then the question now, especially in the wake of the age of Christendom, is either to return to this sense of sort of natural sacrality. Can we work our way back into nature? Can we become good pagans? We can't. We try to. We end up buying joss sticks and crystals and dream catchers, and it doesn't work. Or there's a despair beyond Christian hope, which I think is deeper than any sort of despair that was known to the pagan past.
Thank you. David, thank you very much. You have stretched our minds and exhausted our fingers, at least for those of us who are trying to take notes. I am sure that people have questions, comments, and I hope that you will entertain some.
Oh, yes, especially if they entertain me.
For those who have questions, there is a microphone.
Or not. Or we could just go.
Pardon me, I won't use the microphone. I think I can be heard. I'm embarrassed by standing up. You started to make what I was expecting to be a distinction over truth with Pilate and you describe Pilate as being an embodiment of truth in his own mind, as well as in the reality of the empire at that time. And then you refer to the gospel, and if I'm correct, he replies to Christ, what is truth? So I was expecting some type of contrast between Christ's version and his version, and why would he ask that?
Yeah, that was actually why I said I was heading in that direction. You're right, but I got distracted by my own blurred vision, and so. Well, I mean, it's a fascinating moment, obviously, in the Gospels, because there's nothing else quite like that. What is truth? Nietzsche was especially fond of that passage. He thought it was the only really good part of the New Testament. It's like Pilate for him is the ironist. But I mean, for me, because the Gospel of John as a work of literature is supremely well crafted. I mean, there's not a wasted line in a sense. I mean, it's quite clear that what's going on there is he's looking at the truth. But for him, those sorts of truths don't figure. I mean, there is the truth of power, which he embodies. Christ tells him, well, no, what power you have actually is given to you from above. But, that sort of truth he understands. But then again, in the Gospel of John, it's Christ himself who is the truth. I mean, this is stated quite clearly. And so, again, when I say that the truth that's revealed at Easter is this person, Jesus of Nazareth, not the spiritual benefit of his sacrifice in the simple sense that we're used to. That is, not that he, having laid down his life for our salvation, we receive a benefit from it, and now he's disappeared into the night. No, the salvation that comes from Christ's self-giving to the Father is Christ himself. He is, in fact, the truth that he can. And that does not fit. I mean, it really does not fit within any number of immemorial religious notions where there has to be an exchange of a different sort. Something of supreme value, dignity, or beauty is sacrificed by us to feed the God in response. It's the sort of order of sacrifice that Jesus embodies works in a completely different direction, and the whole order of truth, rather than being that of this order that Pilate represents, the cosmos, the empire, the fragility and yet eternality of this order, is rather the truth of the God of infinite love, self-outpouring love, who returns to make us his own. And it seems to me it does fall outside all not just rational expectations, but sacred expectations. The tall man at the back of the room,
Thank you very much, David, for your talk. It was a really wide-ranging, fascinating and poetic talk. You took us all the way through from the Garden of Our First Innocence, through the world of sacrificial piety, to the Garden of the Resurrection.
Overly ambitious, wasn't
Pardon?
A bit overly ambitious.
Okay, it was a long journey.
Yeah.
Through the Garden of the Resurrection, where we are again strangers to death. What I wanted to ask you, and give you an opportunity for just speaking a little bit more about, is to ask where in the way you were presented, the conquering of death by Christ's resurrection comes about through his death.
Yeah.
And our sharing in that resurrection, in some senses, doesn't make us alien to death, but only comes about through our death. The consequence of it is really that we take up our cross and learn to die daily.
Yeah.
I'm sure you think about this, but just maybe want to speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's clear that that in a world imprisoned to death, the death itself has to be transformed into a passage to life by Christ. I mean, of course, I can't say this in a way that goes beyond the speculative, because it's just a doctrinal reflection. But the sacrifice of Christ, the thesia of Christ in the gospel, I've always, especially in the book of Hebrews, I mean, it's clearly put in the context of the Korban of Yom Kippur, the sacrifice of the Day of Atonement. And there is an oblation made there, but the principal act that's taking place is that all of Israel is submitting to the judgment of God. The lifeblood of the community is being brought into the presence of the glory of God and being made alive again, though the people are dead in sin. This is not like the Aztecs feeding the sun, right? I mean, it's understood here that death is a condition that has come about through sin. It is the wage of sin. And that by turning that death over to God, entering into the holy place, new life will be brought forth. So that the dying itself is transformed from the ultimate reality, the divine economy that sustains all things, to the burden and the condition of estrangement and exile that's overcome by God. I don't want to suggest that when I talk about death being something alien and unnatural, I mean, there I'm just, I think, standing on firm scriptural ground, that plan A, so to speak, would be that God could join us to himself as he would were there no death, had there been no sin, were in the unimaginable other possibility, in illo tempore. So that in an ontological sense, in essence, death is not meaningful. That said, in a world bound to death, the triumph over death must be the actual transformation of death itself into new life. And that requires dying to ourselves, dying to the world, dying to sin, and supremely God consenting to die in our stead. I thought he had a question.
Please come with the microphone.
I'd still like an answer sort of to, you enumerated a few of the sort of not very good Christian responses. Will of God, predestination. What is the proper, based on what is the proper response? Both when we view these large catastrophes like the tsunami event, and what is the response that we offer in consolation to the father who's lost 4 children in that event? I mean, what is the proper?
I'm not going to be able to answer the pastoral question very well for the simple reason I haven't got a pastoral bone in my body. And but I mean, I'll say this: that if I had lost my child, I certainly wouldn't be comforted by any of the responses I suggested. I would want the absolute evil of my son's death to be acknowledged. To be told that it was God's goodwill or part of God's plan would be obscene to me, and would, of course, make me either hate my comforter or hate God or hate both. No doubt I'd be very close to that anyway at that point. The one thing I can say is Christians, I mean, if they take the gospel seriously, is say nothing. Well, say nothing might be a good response to begin with, actually. But when it comes time to say something, say nothing that suggests, and this is both fidelity to the gospel and compassion to someone who's suffering, say nothing that suggests that the death of that child was anything but an absolute and damnable evil. Do not ask people to find comfort in such things, or to see a deeper meaning in them, or accept them simply as the. This, part of it in writing this book, I got a letter from a physician in. He was in Iraq. He's a military physician, and he works with victims of combat or explosive devices. And he wrote me. He's a very nice fellow. He had been raised Catholic, but he drifted away, and he'd come back to Christianity through a Presbyterian church. It was fairly, to say, rigorously Catholic in its theology, and he had to call a mother to tell her that her son had died, and she too was of one of these congregations that was very, very profoundly Calvinist in the most literal, in the most fundamentalist sense. And on hearing that her son had died, her only response was, "God's will is perfect." It seems to me there's something positively deranged in that. Now, there may be comfort in it. I don't know. I suppose there is. As I said, there is religious comfort in that, the notion of it. But I don't think it's Christian comfort. I mean, at some level, if you're just saying, well, God in His providence will take care of my son, all right. But that's not what she meant. I mean, He was quite clear. He talked to her. That's not what she meant. What she meant was that from before the beginning of the world, her son was destined to die then and there. It's all part of the greater spectacle of God's sovereignty playing itself out through history. And whether He be saved or be damned, that too would be how God shows forth His sovereignty in mercy or in wrath. And this is a kind of strange fatalism, which I think falls perfectly within the ambit of certain kinds of, I guess you could say, pagan wisdom. Now, it is possible that she found real comfort in that sentiment. In that case, that's fine. But at that point, I would still say not to utter such words simply on the grounds of fidelity to the gospel, which I don't think gives us any warrant for speaking in that way. Because death is the last enemy who will be overthrown. We're never, you can comb the Gospels through and you just don't find many cheerful, happy, optimistic passages about death. The New Testament, we don't, it is hard to think our way back to millennia, but I mean, let's not forget that the Apostle Paul means what he says when he talks about the devil as the god of this world, and he talks about the thrones and principalities and dominions, the powers in high places, the angelic. He sees the presence of Christ in history as spiritual warfare, as cosmic warfare, in which creation, which has been bound to an alien enemy, death, and especially those of us who have been sold into slavery in the prison house of death, have been set free by an act of conquest. And the radical nature of that, as I say, not only in how it affects religious consciousness, but in how we should think of our faith and how we should approach questions of spiritual consolation. At least this was my experience in reading, as I say, as I was preparing to write this book. My experience was that somehow for many Christians just doesn't remain at the front of their minds. They don't use the New Testament language. Instead, they rationalize death in a way that is, as I say, maybe comforting, but I don't think Christian. So.
I once spoke with Father Paul Tarazi, who teaches Old Testament here. I don't know if you've met him or heard of him, but
well, I've heard of him. Yeah, I've read him. I meant to go to his talk today, but I had that headache. So,
I'm not sure what he talked about today, but he made he was very emphatic, as is his style, about. We were speaking about life after death and so forth. He was very emphatic about the fact that the resurrected Lord appears with wounds on His body, and he used that to express his belief in the fact that the resurrection will somehow be, in the resurrection we too will be somehow expressed in some characteristics of this. Is this just the Antiochian?
No, I was just reflecting. I hope I'm better looking, though. Well, no, I mean that's is a profound truth that the wounds of Christ are borne by the resurrected Christ, right? That as I said, the passage to new life for us is through death, through His death, and I don't know if it's particularly Antiochian to say that. As for what character you say, what characteristics the resurrection body in general will have carried over from this life, you mean? I wouldn't know how to answer that. I tend to think it's a great mystery hidden in God. This one.
Two questions, so why don't you both?
You talked about Gregory of Nyssa in saying that sometimes he seems almost not to see death because he sees it a continual expansion. I don't know how many of you have seen those two posters of the life of the righteous man and the life of the slothful man. The first printed, there's like about 16 scenes, and the one kid he's doing the study in, and the other one's like breaking up a bird's nest, and in the end, in the very last one, they show the death of the both of them. And there are two separate plaques with like a whole story, and one guy, he drinks a lot, and then he sells his last wheel. Anybody see that? Anyway, it kind of shows this distinction between how one approaches death, because then they show him at his funeral bed, and everyone's there, and the angels are there, and then the unrighteous man, he's kind of seen. No one's there. There's like one or two people there. And anyway, what I'm trying to get at is how an individual, when they approach death, because we've all known people who probably were near dying, how does it, I'm not sure just how to phrase the question, but how does that connect to, we talked about death in a general scope. Can you give us some more insight about how it applies to us individually, sort of?
Probably not. I almost died only once, as I recall. It happened in 1990 when I was run over by a car, and was in surgery several times. It was to repair the legs. The damage was actually to my bones and flesh. It wasn't, but for that one moment, I was visibly separate from my body. That is, I could see it around me and see things around, and then went back. That doesn't give one much insight on preparing for death. It just gives one a sense that maybe it's quite jarring in some cases. But I do know this: those I've seen die preparing for death. At times it's just terrible and sordid, and then the evil of death and the sheer absurdity of it is palpable. But there are others, at least two experiences I've had of persons whose death seemed to radiate a strange sort of beauty that seemed to make death itself completely unreal in their case. And it was real, obviously. But and I was talking about the sensibility in Gregory of Nyssa, but I got a sense of it there in these cases of somebody who's already so much absorbed in the light of Easter, so to speak, that the moment of death becomes strangely beautiful and untroubling, and not a moment of release as a moment of homecoming, but the individual experience of death, I don't think you could shed much light on that.
I just wanted to come back to the comment on the cross by Father John, and also your statement that now with Christ our life is a journey, an infinite journey towards God. And the two go together, because it seems to me that Orthodoxy and Christianity is the religion of the cross, and that is our understanding of death. That's the means of death that Christ suffered, and therefore he told us we had to carry our cross as well, which the final one is our own death and the death of our loved ones, it seems to me. So perhaps in sharing each other's burdens and carrying the cross in the suffering with the understanding that we're doing it out of love for God, towards whom we are journeying, that is what gives us hope and strength to live in Christ through the cross on our daily crosses, I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I don't know if it needs much comment because I think you said it very well. But I mean, that's a perfect example, though, of what I mean about death transfigured and transformed. I mean, that in itself is death conquered already in our bodies and in our lives. This bearing our death willingly as a way of life, as you know, is taking upon ourselves the burden of a death that we know is already. I mean, the end has already come. I mean, you know, we have seen in historical time the end of history. We've seen the resurrection. It makes it possible then for us not to reconcile ourselves to the inevitability of death and to the cosmic process, or see death as just an escape from the world. It makes it possible for us, rather, willingly, gladly, gratefully, joyfully, in great pain, but still confident in the love of God, to take death on ourselves as something already conquered and therefore fruitful, as something that we already live beyond in Christ. You know, as Christ also says that his burden is light. I mean, you know, he says, take up the cross, and elsewhere he tells us that the burden, that the yoke lies light on our neck, and the two should be kept together because there's a certain paradox there. I'll just say one last comment before we go. You know, when I've been making these vast abstract claims about cultures built around an economy of death, and I mean, it seems to be especially part of the great sort of Indo-European pagan tradition. You see it in India and Europe, is that can become quite unbearable consciously to those who live in it. I mean, you get great movements of detachment. In India, the early Upanishadic period, and then Buddhism. I thought, well, you know, this is the universe of death. Just throw the whole thing on the sacrificial pyre and have done with it, in a sense. Just, it would be better if it stopped. And you see that also in the early Gnostic movements, the sense that, well, there is this world of death, and then, well, God himself is evil, the God of this world, and so our real home lies beyond it. And all of those are possible responses to this world, but the gospel also doesn't do that. I mean, it never... I mean, the cross remains with us in a way. It's not detachment in that sense. It's mortification, abnegation, but at the end of the day, we remain in the body, in the world, in historical time, bearing the cross of Christ, knowing that death has been conquered, and therefore not seeking escape anymore. But, you know. Anyway, that might have been a rather obscure way to end, I think. But,
Books and numerous spoken word recordings are available from St. Vladimir's Seminary Press and Bookstore. For more information or to request a free catalog, visit the press online at www.svspress.com or call toll-free 1-800-204-2665. That is www.svspress.com or 1-800-204-2665. For more information on St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, visit our website at www.svots.edu or call 914-961-8313. This recording was prepared by the Systems and Information Technologies Department of St. Vladimir Seminary. Copyright 2006. All rights reserved.